10x your service design offering with Smapply. Take 20% off any order with This Is HCD 20 off. Let's superpower you and your design team's potential. Sign up at smapply.app. Enjoy the episode from your friends at Smapply, helping support This Is HCD podcast.
Hello and welcome to Moments of Change. My name is Melanie Rayment and I'm a social designer based in Sydney, Australia, and currently a director at the Australian Centre for Social Innovation. Moments of Change is a podcast dedicated to exploring the moments that we learn from as we seek to design and cultivate positive social change. In this episode, I speak with Joanna Choukeir, incoming Director of Design and Innovation at RSA based in London. Joanna is a design practitioner, researcher, educator and thought leader with experience across the UK and Lebanon, previously working as Health Director at FutureGov and spending 10 years leading Us Creates, a service design agency for health and wellbeing, alongside co-founders Zoe Stanton and Mary Cook. She also currently holds a number of roles with universities in the UK. In this episode, Joanna shares her views and experience on place-based design, challenging the status quo, designing for systemic change, and being community-led. She shares her stories from work in seeking to address health inequalities in the London Borough of Tower Hamlets, catalysed by, at the time, the unique outcomes-based commissioning approach. I hope you enjoy this episode of Moments of Change. Joanna Choukeir, welcome to Moments of Change.
Thank you for having me, Melanie.
Can you please describe your upcoming role and how you're seeking to create positive social change?
So I'm a social design practitioner, lecturer and thought leader, and I'm now in transition on maternity leave with twins, which is proving challenging in its own way through lockdown.
You are my hero.
Yeah, I think it's getting easier, but I still wouldn't call it easy. But for the last 10 years, I was leading Us Creates, which is a London-based service design agency focusing on health and wellbeing, alongside co-founders Zoe Stanton and Mary Cook. And in 2018, Us Creates was acquired by FutureGov, and I moved on to direct the health portfolio there for a year before going on maternity leave. And at the end of August, I'm very excited to be joining the RSA as their Director of Design and Innovation. So in my new role, I'm looking forward to championing how design can be used as a powerful enabler to support the RSA to deliver on its new vision, which is a really exciting vision, a world where everyone is able to participate in creating a better future.
Brilliant. I think, it sounds like now more than ever, we need to be thinking even further and more deeply about this. Tell me, how has your purpose evolved over your career?
So it's really interesting because I've always been passionate about making social change through my work. But I suppose what's changed is how I believe I can make that change happen. So it's the how rather than what I wanted to achieve. So I think having grown up in the middle of a civil war, traveled around the world, having had a father who is a diplomat, all of these things sort of tune me into my social and political responsibility at a personal level. But early on, I thought I needed to work in politics or diplomacy to be able to make change. I definitely didn't think I could do that through design. But back then, I knew there were obstacles for women to really achieve their full potential in these sectors. And graphic design at the time, that was the 90s, was cool and trendy. I was told I was told I was talented. I actually come from 3 generations of designers in the family.
Wow.
Which is quite unusual. So I used design, I suppose, as my creative outlet to the social issues I was passionate about. So first of all, that started out as being sort of a design activist. So getting involved in like Greenpeace campaigns, social rallies against injustice. And I suppose gradually, so for example, as I was doing my PhD research, I thought, well, maybe I can make change happen through being a theorist. So using like design research and practice as a way to generate new theories, methodologies, guidance for other designers to be able to apply some of these techniques to make change happen. And then at the same time, I was working at UsCreate and then FutureGov, and I thought that maybe making change happen needed to be about creating or designing interventions that address specific problems. So, for example, stop smoking interventions, or interventions that reduce childhood obesity, or increase early cancer screening, or reduce pressure on urgent care services. But as I've sort of experienced through my career, lots of different types of challenges, and realized that there's lots of different movers and shakers in the system, I'm becoming to recognize the power of social movements. And that's what I'm really wanting to explore in my new role at the RSA. So how do you create social movements that can combine all of these different ways of making change happen at the same time, so we are all moving in the same direction to really shift the system?
You mentioned being an activist, and indeed your personal background and experience in civil war. What does being an activist mean to you today, in terms of what have you brought forward, the learnings that you still carry with you each day in thinking about how you will build social movements?
Yeah. So I think activism is still very relevant in my career today. I feel like activism is sort of part of my life mission. All the things I care about, I'm still an activist for. So things like the Black Lives Movement now, Extinction Rebellion. I mean, if you look at it, there's a significant need for these movements to really shake the system, for people's voice to be heard, for needs to be expressed, to really challenge the status quo, and demonstrate that there's a different way of thinking and doing for the system. So grassroots movements are absolutely necessary, as well as sort of top-down organizing, policy making. And it's about where these sort of worlds collide, where really the essence of systemic change starts to happen. So they have a significant role to play. And through sort of all of my work, I never discount activism as an approach to making some of that change.
I love that you talk about both the sort of the bottom up and the top down, and finding that space. I think that is really where the magic happens. And I think it's a real art in being able to recognize both of those different types of ways of approaching social change, and essentially orchestrating that, or at least building upon the strengths of what those types of different perspectives would bring. Before the show, we talked about your experiences in place-based design, and working with communities to shape change. What's the moment of change that you've brought today to the show to talk about?
Yeah, so I guess sort of a perfect example of these worlds colliding is a program called Communities Driving Change. So this is a program I was directing from a design perspective, or I started directing in 2017, and it's still ongoing. So it was commissioned by a local authority in Tower Hamlets in London to reduce health inequalities. So to give you a sense of Tower Hamlets as a place, it's the 10th most deprived borough nationally. It has the fastest growing population in London, 50% non-white population. And we understand the relationship between high populations of BAME groups and health inequalities. And shockingly, there's a 6 to 8 year variation in life expectancy between its poorest neighbourhoods and other affluent neighbourhoods across the country. And it's really sad, because although healthcare is free for all at the point of use or at the point of access, we can clearly see evidence of health inequalities happening in the health outcomes and the data that reveal some of the health outcomes in that place. So we took a place-based approach. So thinking about a place, so when we talk about place, that's sort of a 500-meter radius, which is usually when people sort of move around a place. That's
Yes.
sort of typically, without using public transport, that tends to be the space or the distance that they cross. So about 1,500 people, or maybe 600 households if you're looking at an urban place. So we thought about that place as one population, one neighborhood, one health and care system, one budget. So bring all of these things together to be able to deliver on one vision. And the reason that particular program was different was or I suppose there's a number of reasons why it was different and unprecedented in terms of how it was commissioned. First of all, it was outcomes-based commissioning. So the Health and Wellbeing Board and the Clinical Commissioning Group and public health team in the local authority didn't sort of look at the health data and then think, oh, we need to commission a weight management service, a sexual screening service, maternity services. They thought, well, we need to deliver on a vision where we can address a lot of the health inequalities. So they co-produced a vision with local residents around communities feeling in control, supporting each other, taking joint action on the issues that they really cared about. And this program was very much about delivering that vision, so rather than a service. It was hyper-local, as I mentioned, so dividing Tower Hamlets into 4 wards and 12 hyper-local neighbourhoods. Some of the neighbourhoods were just one estate, like that is how small the work was and focused. It's a long-term program that's really hard to see in health commissioning. So a 5-year program, recognizing that systemic change takes time. It's not a 12-week intervention. And finally, it's about bringing together person-centered design, but also overlaying that with asset-based community development, or ABCD, which is an approach that's advocated for by Cormac Russell, if you're familiar with him. And he talks about the importance of starting with what is strong in a community rather than what is wrong. And actually the problem with services and the design of services is that often these disable people from being able to support themselves. So there's quite a paradox between, in a way, design and asset-based community development. But there's also strengths in bringing these two approaches together.
Joanna, you mentioned outcomes-based commissioning, and of course going into these communities, and we'll touch on some of the deeper understanding of the story of change in a moment. But I'm just interested in that alone, the trust alone, sort of bestowed upon you by firstly the commissioning group in and around the trust around outcomes and thinking about what that means for them as an organisation and the risk perhaps that's attached to that. And indeed, then also yourselves going into communities where I assume they've probably been over-researched and over-consulted quite a lot.
Yeah.
I'm interested in the trust on both sides and how you were able to deepen that and start that off with them.
Yeah, absolutely. So I remember when we first saw the tender come out, so that was with me working at Creates, we thought that was such a bold brief and we'd never seen anything like it. And through speaking to some of the commissioners at Tower Hamlets, it became apparent that this was one of the NHS exemplars. So NHS England had put some money or some funding forward for local authorities to try different approaches to address health inequality. So in a way, this was that was the safety net, that this was an opportunity to test something new. There was no guarantee that this will work, but they treated evaluation with a lot of care. So we had University of East London as an evaluation partner from the outset on this. So I suppose that sort of setting where this is an experimental place to try something new where nothing has worked before, or very few programs have really had the sustainability and longevity to achieve this sort of systemic change in the longer term was really supportive. And there was also a lot of passion from that leadership team within the local authority and across the Health and Wellbeing Board. They really understood a lot of the theories. So Cormac Russell's approach, person-centered design, Michael Marmot's review, so taking a social determinants approach or a holistic approach to addressing health inequalities. So they're really passionate about some of these theories and approaches and really keen to pioneer them in that space. So that really helped. And then the second part of your question around community consultation and consultation fatigue. So that was really difficult, actually. We were misunderstood because often with a lot of the commissioning that happens, you sort of buy an off-the-shelf service, and then consultation means, or you might design a service like just behind a desk and then put it in front of the community to feed back on, to talk about what they like about it and what they dislike. And we were coming with nothing. We weren't really putting anything on the table. We were just asking people what their dreams were for their place now and in the future for their children and grandchildren. And so obviously there was a lot of skepticism around how it was possible for a local authority to really not come with an agenda. So the politics behind the program were questioned. But I guess we built trust gradually. We expected some of these reactions and we didn't see them as failure. We just saw them as, I suppose, work that needs to be done.
Yeah.
Or work that needs to be done. We made sure we spoke to everyone who was engaged locally, who was already doing good work and who had a strong voice. That's particularly in the first phase of work where we were scoping the neighbourhoods we really wanted to focus on, where we could deliver the biggest difference or make the biggest change. And then in the second phase, once we've identified these 12 hyperlocal neighbourhoods, we knocked on every single door. So that was our approach to building trust. So knocking on every single door, introducing ourselves, making sure that the same people on the field were consistent, that faces were familiar, that we had a base where everyone could find us and contact us. We worked with local delivery partners and organizations that the communities were familiar with, who really understood these neighborhoods and who knew people in these neighborhoods. And we delivered quick results. And I think that's really important to demonstrate that change can happen very early on. So although we had some very sort of fairly long-term action plans, we also had the quick wins, and we made sure that, the community, the wall down this dodgy alley was painted with murals that would make it a bit more cheerful and that would make it feel a bit safer for families with young children to go out and hang out, and things like that were absolutely important.
I know we were talking prior to the show about that sort of need to have those portfolio of interventions across those different time horizons because, some of those quick wins were so instrumental in building that trust. What are some of the sort of more medium and long-term things that you were trying to change, and how did that evolve over time?
Yeah. So I'll give you an example of a medium-term intervention that turned into more of a longer-term intervention. In one of the neighborhoods, we spoke to a lot of young girls, teenage girls, about how they felt in that place. And there was the sense of, I suppose, lack of safety and lack of confidence to go out on their own. And to really do the things they wanted to do and just be themselves in the neighborhood they've grown up in all of their life. And so one of the suggestions that these girls came up with was to run self-defense classes. And when we were looking for a venue for these classes, we came to realize that the local youth centres were perceived as spaces for boys, not for girls. And so they would rarely go there. They didn't think that the sessions or activities that these youth centres had on offer were relevant to the girls, and they didn't feel safe going there. So we worked with a local provider, My Time Active, to run the Bengali, so the girls were predominantly from Bengali backgrounds. So to run these self-defense classes for Bengali teenage girls within the youth centre, we picked a day in the week that was a girls-only day. So it ran girls-only sessions as a transition to creating a safe space where both girls and boys could meet, but that was sort of almost like the stepping stone into that. And so in the medium term, these sessions were run. And then in the longer term, My Time Active started training these girls to become trainers and to run the self-defense classes themselves. And this whole process revealed that girls aren't really involved in the governance and decision-making process for how these youth centres are run, how their programmes are designed and curated. So that led to some of them being represented on the steering group for the youth centre, but also joining the Health and Wellbeing Board at the whole health and care system.
Yes.
Local authority and the clinical commissioning group as a way of influencing decisions that affect young people in that area. So you could sort of see how from a really small intervention that really rippled across sort of systemic layers into young people and young girls having a voice and influencing local policy making.
You mentioned governance there, and it's so wonderful to hear that you had young people, involved in the decision making. How did you bring about, multiple people from across the community into that decision making to really guide authentic decision making for the program and for the change for community?
Yeah. So there's a couple of things that were really important throughout the process. Um, the first is understanding key players in a system and bring them on board throughout the process. And the second is thinking about the social determinants of change and who these key players would be across all the social determinants. So in regards to the first point, so initially in the scoping phase, we made sure that we engaged with everyone from local residents to frontline staff to local business owners, English teachers like ESOL teachers,
Yes.
shopkeepers, faith leaders. So everyone who had, I suppose, an asset, something to give and something to say was important. And then in the second stage or in the second phase, when we started to co-design local dreams or co-produce local dreams and then co-design local action plans for these places, we organized or we brought people together around what we called local action groups. So these are individuals in that hyper-local neighbourhood who are committed to making some of this change happen, some of these dreams come true. And they include everyone from local residents to some of the service providers in that area to local policymakers, so councillors. So really including, because you sort of need the residents who can really champion and be a strong voice in that community to activate that change. But you also need people at different layers of the system who can sort of unblock some of the things that the community needs in order to make things happen. So the way we did that was through bringing together these local action groups that continue to support in shaping and delivering some of this work. But as you said, the membership in these groups changes and evolves over time. And I guess the limitation is that it's dependent on finding the right people at the right time. It's selective to those who have the motivation, the energy, the time to give. So that membership hasn't been consistent. But that's the nature of place and transience, and I think it's at the end of the day, it's about continuing to push forward to make that neighbourhood a better place to live and to work and to retire in, to learn in, and so on.
You mentioned co-producing local dreams. I love that. I'm taking that with me for the rest of the week. That's my phrase. That's my phrase of the week.
Yeah.
When you look back at this, and there obviously were multiple interventions and multiple interactions that you and others in your teams had over time. But when you sit back and personally think about your experience in this, what's that one thing that really makes your heart sing about looking back at your involvement in that?
So I think fundamentally what I keep coming back to is just how common. So, communities in Tower Hamlets are so diverse. You have people from all corners of the world with all sorts of backgrounds. some people work there, some people live there, some people have always lived there, some people that, come and go as tenants, short-term tenants. But really, the thing that really struck me is that everyone really just wants to be happy in that place, to have a happy and positive life, and particularly those with families, like their dreams with young children, their dreams were consistently just wanting their children to have a good life, to grow up in a positive neighborhood that enabled them to have the education that would then support them to have, a successful career moving forward. And it was just energizing to see just such a diverse community coming together around some of these shared dreams. And it helped us focus our energy and hopes on some of these aspirations rather than dwelling on, all the negativity and all the pessimism that the numbers, the data was showing us about Tower Hamlets as a place in terms of health deprivation.
And looking back now, what do you think are some of those couple of learnings that you really take away with you about how you did what you did and the experiences you had and you take into your practice today?
Yeah. So I think we've touched on some of these, but I'll sum these up as 4 key learnings. Firstly, it's about thinking about needs and assets hand in hand. So by overlaying a person-centered design approach with asset-based community development, we were able to not just look at what people need, which is that's person-centered design, what needs do we need to meet? But
Yes.
also looking at what are the assets that we can activate and mobilize and leverage and amplify in this place? And instead of just asking what are people's challenges, we were asking what are their strengths, their hopes, their dreams. This wasn't just about solving wicked problems. It was about developing sustainable communities that can continue to thrive once this program comes to an end, once we step out of the picture. And instead of just co-designing with people, we were supporting them to co-produce and to self-organize, which is the ABCD approach, the asset-based community development approach. So really bring these 2 approaches hand in hand that differ in lots of different ways, but at the end of the day, they both aim to uncover the why behind the what and really understand root causes and not just symptoms to make change happen at a systemic level. So that's one key takeaway or learning. The other is really moving from health behavior change as an intervention space to really holistic change across the social determinants. I think we're often guilty of thinking about health inequalities as just people not adopting the healthy behavior. If people would just stop smoking or eat more fruits and vegetables. And often people have the best intentions in the world, but they can't get the job to be able to provide them with financial security to look after their families, or they live in really poor quality housing, high pollution neighborhoods. They might struggle with health literacy, so they can't really talk about the symptoms or the health issues they have in such a way that would enable them to access the best treatment or care. So I guess the key takeaway from this program is to really think about health across all of these social determinants. So across all the things that we did on the program from data, so we didn't just look at health data, we looked at crime rates, we looked at betting shops, we looked at educational outcomes. When we mapped assets, again, it wasn't just health assets, it was all assets. When we engaged stakeholders, it wasn't just health services and public health teams within the local authority. The same with the vision. The vision didn't have to be about health, it had to be about genuinely what these people's dreams were, these local communities' dreams were. And then similarly with the local action plans, the action plans didn't have to fit into like a health intervention, a health specific intervention, because we could understand the connection between all of these different things. So that's the second learning. The third is, so from a single service focus to systemic collaboration. So rather than thinking about health inequalities as something that needs a single service, really thinking about all these different layers. And the example I mentioned with the self-defense classes for Bengali girls touches on all of these different layers. So how do you influence everything in the place, from how policy is developed to really reduce health inequalities accountabilities as much as possible to how places are designed and how people interact within that place. And then the final learning is, I guess, going back to outcomes-based commissioning in the beginning. So making sure that we measure what matters. So moving from measuring outputs and deliverables to measuring outcomes and impact. So yeah, I think these would be the 4 key takeaways for me.
Joanna, you mentioned there about measuring what's important. We know in big systems projects, it's quite difficult to think about how you measure those outcomes over time, and indeed how you even baseline the change. How is it that you did that in this project?
Yeah. So obviously it's really challenging to sort of talk about outcomes and then try and measure something as vague as that. And obviously on the program, we measured some of the usual things like, or we collected data around some of the usual things like 800 people engaged in developing the local action plans, or we worked with 12 neighborhoods, etc. But when it boiled down to outcomes, we wanted to be led by what the community desired for their neighborhoods. So the local community came up with I statements, so statements that start with I, that describe the sort of future they want to see for their places. So things like, I can see people of all ages using outdoor spaces in my area, or I feel locally safe, or I feel proud that I can send my kids to school, or I feel proud that I can send my children on the school walk alone. So we use these statements as a baseline in terms of what people wanted to achieve. And then gradually through the program, we worked with University of East London and as an evaluation partner and the delivery partners locally to come back and ask those who have experienced the program how true these statements were becoming. So it's a very simple way of really being led by people in your evaluation, but also it comes, I suppose, with its own set of challenges because people's dreams and desires for a place constantly change. So the I statements were there. People also wanted to change their minds about what they wanted to see. And I suppose, yes, it's challenging, but at the same time, demonstrating that we are continuing to iterate these I statements really shows that we're listening and we're continuing to unblock anything that's standing in the way of these communities from, doing what they wanted to do for their place and for their families.
We're coming to the end of the show, Joanna, and I've personally learnt so much, which is exciting, and I could talk to you for a lot longer. What is one of those wildly important goals over the next year related to your practice that you might share with others?
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier that I'm now much more interested in fulfilling my purpose through movement building, and this really requires understanding issues at a systemic level. So convening the right players, creating the right conditions for everyone with a stake or influence in the system to create or adopt their own interventions, whether that might be changing policy, rebelling, creating a new theory that can support others to adopt particular ways of working or to share learning. I feel like my new role at the RSA aligns perfectly with that ambition. So becoming a movement builder for change. And that's what I'm going to be sort of looking forward to. So with the RSA, as a platform for ideas that inspire the world. We have 30,000 fellows around the world. We work with a lot of partners and we have high ambitions for the change that we want to see. The challenge for me now is how do we all, across that movement, how do we all align against some of the same issues and understand and support one another to make that change happen? And how do I, as Director of Design Innovation, create the conditions that enable people to use design approaches and innovation approaches to do some of that work?
Joanna, thank you so much for coming on Moments of Change. I look forward to following your next step in your journey and hearing more about what you do at the RSA. Thank you.
Thank you, Melanie, again for having me.
So there you have it. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. And if you would like to be a part of the conversation or the community, hop on over to thisishcd.com, where you can request to join the Slack community and help shape future episodes, connect with other designers around the world, and join the newsletter where you can win books and get updates. Subscribe to content on Apple Podcasts or Spotify and listen to any of our other podcasts, such as Getting Started in Design and Bringing Design Closer with Gerry Scullion, Power of 10 with Andy Pillane, Decoding Culture with Dr. John Curran, Prod Pod with Adrian Tan, Ethnopod with Jay Husbrook, Moments of Change with myself, Melanie Rayment, and Talking Shop, our community podcast.